Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are diving into something absolutely fascinating. We're looking at a deeply insightful theological analysis by Dr. Robert A. Peterson. We're going to explore exactly how ancient Israel formed this incredibly unique identity. It's really like a complex, multi-layered blueprint that ultimately set the stage for the promised Messiah. We're talking about the profound intersection of atonement, worship, geography, and prophecy. It's a massive, sweeping story, but Dr. Peterson breaks it down just brilliantly. So let's get into it.
Okay, let's dive into this. Think about it for a second. How do a people actually define themselves when they claim to be uniquely chosen by the creator of the universe? That is the core mystery of our explainer today. Because a truly unique identity requires a highly specific foundation. You can't just be, any run-of-the-mill nation if you're chosen by the one true God. Your entire culture, your daily practices, your whole worldview, it all has to reflect that distinct calling. And Dr. Peterson argues that this identity, it wasn't an accident. It was purposefully, carefully constructed by God through a series of foundational pillars.
So to unpack this, we're going to walk through this four-part blueprint. Number 1, identity through sacrifice and worship. Number 2, the promise of the land. Number 3, the voice of the prophets. And number 4, 3 pictures of the Messiah. All right, let's look at the first one.
Pillar number 1, identity through sacrifice and worship. Dr. Peterson notes that the foundational identity of God's people was inextricably tied to the exclusive, highly structured worship of Yahweh.
Now, there's this striking quote from Isaiah 53 that perfectly captures what this worship was actually pointing toward. It says, "Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him. When his soul makes an offering for guilt, he shall see his offspring." Honestly, on a pre-faith reading, that text is kind of shocking, right? A righteous, completely sinless servant is voluntarily crushed by God. It almost sounds unjust. Well, until you realize what's actually happening here. Isaiah is introducing this groundbreaking concept of voluntary penal substitution, meaning the servant is literally stepping in and taking the punishment meant for someone else. So the crucial point is that this whole idea hinges on the Hebrew concept of asham. This roughly translates to a guilt or reparation offering. Scholars like Peter Gentry emphasize that this wasn't just your generic everyday sacrifice. No, it was specifically about making compensation or restitution to God for Israel's covenant disloyalty. It laid the absolute groundwork for universal forgiveness. The identity of God's people became so deeply rooted in this profound knowledge that their sins required, and amazingly, were provided, a substitute. And this atonement was really just one part of a vibrant, living system of worship. God's exclusive covenant was actively, physically practiced day in and day out. You had the 10 Commandments demanding absolute exclusivity, literally no other gods allowed. Their feasts, like Passover and Tabernacles, weren't just big parties. They were these incredibly sensory historical reminders of God delivering them. And the tabernacle, which was later replaced by this centralized temple under David and Solomon, was entirely unique. While surrounding nations were busy worshiping, stone idols, Israel built precise, magnificent structures designed to house the visible, living glory of God himself. Their worship quite literally defined who they were. Moving right along to pillar number 2, the promise of the land. From the very opening chapters of the biblical text, God anchored his people's identity to a specific physical place. Just look at this massive span of history where the land is totally central. It starts all the way back in the creation era with the physical Garden of Eden. Then, during the patriarchal era, God promises Abraham very specific real estate. Fast forward to the conquest era, and Joshua leads the people to actually go in and take possession of it. When they disobey later on, during the exilic period, they get thrown out of the land to Babylon, only to eventually return. And Dr. Peterson points out something amazing here. This physical land promise ultimately projects all the way forward into a future eternity, the creation of a new heavens and a new earth. The whole concept of land evolves from a local garden in the Middle East to a literal cosmic eternal renewal of all creation. It's huge. To really wrap your head around why this physical land mattered so much, just listen to this agonizing cry from Psalm 137. It was written while they were captives in Babylon. How can we sing the Lord's song on foreign soil? It breaks your heart, doesn't it? It highlights the profound emotional weight of the exile. Their geographic land was so central to their covenant with God that losing it, well, it felt like losing their very selves. Being removed from that land meant their identity was fundamentally fractured. All right, pillar number 3, the voice of the prophets. God's people were strictly forbidden from using magic and divination like the surrounding nations. So instead, God gave them the prophets.
And this brilliantly illustrates their dual role. See, there's a really vital distinction between forthtelling and foretelling. Forthtelling meant speaking directly to their present day, calling out corruption, warning of imminent judgment, and demanding life-changing repentance. But they didn't just stop there. They also engaged in foretelling. That's predicting the future, specifically the coming of a promised Redeemer. So they didn't just diagnose the present illness, they actively prescribed the future cure. But of course, you might be wondering, how did the people know who to actually listen to? Well, Deuteronomy 18 laid out incredibly strict requirements to protect the nation from frauds. A true prophet had to be raised up from among their own brothers. They had to completely reject those detestable practices we mentioned, like divination. They had to have God's exact words put directly into their mouths. And the ultimate litmus test? Their predictions had to come true 100% of the time. No exceptions. If a prophet spoke a word that didn't happen, boom, they were exposed as false. This incredibly high bar protected the people, for sure, but it also set up this intense, burning expectation for the arrival of the ultimate prophet that Moses spoke of.
Which brings us to pillar number 4, 3 pictures of the Messiah. This is the absolute climax of the blueprint, where worship, the land, and prophecy all converge. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the mysterious title, Son of Man, found in Daniel chapter 7. So Daniel has this vision of a heavenly courtroom, right? And he sees one like a son of man, approaching the Ancient of Days on the clouds of heaven. Now, riding on clouds is imagery reserved exclusively for God. So you have this figure who is distinctly human, yet clearly possesses divine dignity and universal rule. Even more fascinating, as scholars like Joyce Baldwin note, this Son of Man represents both an individual ruler and the corporate community of God's people in their ultimate victory over evil. It is a deeply complex, mysterious dual identity.
Let's move to the next point and see how this builds into a complete profile. Dr. Peterson identifies 3 main messianic pictures here. First, you've got David's royal son from 2 Samuel 7, an eternal king focused on a lasting reign and kingdom. Second, there's Isaiah's suffering servant from Isaiah 53, that vicarious sacrifice focused entirely on atonement and forgiveness of sins. And third, Daniel's Son of Man, the divine human representative focused on the final victory over evil. When you put them all together, kingdom, sacrifice, and victory, you realize pretty quickly that no ordinary human could possibly fulfill all 3 of these roles simultaneously. The blueprint is just incredibly demanding.
And that leaves us with this final, beautiful provocation. Literally everything we've looked at today, the precise systems of atonement, the desperate, heart-wrenching longing for the promised land, the strict, uncompromising words of the prophets, and these 3 incredibly complex pictures of a coming king, servant, and divine representative, it all serves as a foundational blueprint. It entirely defines the identity of the people of God in the Old Testament. So the ultimate question to take away from this explainer is this. If the Old Testament is the incredibly detailed blueprint, how does the arrival, the life, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth finally finish the building? I'll leave you to ponder that one. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and as always, keep learning.